My work has revolved around conservation and development issues, and I think when you talk of conservation and development synergies, it's pretty broad, and a lot of things can be said there. But I thought that it would be interesting to tie this in with with the key audience of today, that is the millennials, if I can use that term properly, because that's where there's a lot of activity. And I was concerned about, the preparedness or how we view the way development and conservation, interact today, but also to find a way for relevance in a manner that, the voices, like Tony mentioned, the voices can be heard beyond our confines, and some of the tools we can use to try and navigate such kind of things. It won't be a very long presentation, but I also think we needed to get some background information, particularly when we talk about the millennials and their relevance in today's discourses, be it in conservation, development, economics, energy, every sector, education. They tend to dominate at the moment. And so it's very important that we really find a place and see where there are conflicts in terms of understanding between the millennials and the X generation. That is where I belong. So first of all, let's just quickly take a look at who are these millennials and why are they so important in our discourse today, perhaps going forward. So without giving a very academic definition, when you talk about millennials, these are basically individuals or people who are born between the 1980s and the 2000s, and so they are kind of in their prime age as we speak. They constitute a lot of the majority. They are also referred to as the Generation Y or the Gen Y. So this is a group just above the Generation X, up to 79. They really constitute the largest generation in the world at the moment. In the US, for instance, they are estimated to be about 80 million of the US population. Globally, it's about 2.5 billion worldwide. In Africa, it's estimated that up to 30% of the population is actually constituted of this group, and that was as at 2017 by the African Development Bank. There is a high chance that the number might have gone up by plus or minus, 2 to 3%. And so the significance of this generation in terms of their participation in different spheres of life really is rising by the day. Now, this group is considered to be the most ethnically and racially diverse, and I think this is something you've encountered everywhere. Although in Kenya, we sometimes go back into our political quagmire, but when it comes to taking care of serious issues, you find that the ideas really transcend ethnicity, they transcend races, and so there's a lot of ideas originating from this group. Some people really think that this is a very talented group. They are well educated. And of course, some people think they're very wonderful human beings. The amount of humanity, the amount of understanding that they have actually is quite important. And they are quite internationally experienced in a way. And so their contribution is quite key. And the fact that they are growing alongside technology is very important, because that's where all the thinking is geared towards making life and work easier through technology. They are very dominant in terms of the social media. So in terms of communication, in terms of relaying of information, they are very adept at that. And so they have a very important role to play in informing the world if they know what they are talking about and if they have the tools and the information they need for that. Do they matter? Of course, yes. And the reason for that is very simple. Like I mentioned, this group by 2020, that's as at now, it is estimated that they really, about 50% of the workforce is actually constituted of these people. I know this is quite context specific. Some of us will argue that if you look at the Kenyan context, for instance, we've always complained that the civil service is dominated by the octogenarians and those old guys. But I think if you carried out, a general census, you'll find that this population really constitutes a huge workforce, be it formal or informal. And the estimates are that by 2030, they're going to really constitute up to 75%. So that means they will already have come of age to really participate or take center stage in the workforce. And that's why it's very important that we focus on them right now to ensure that they enter the workforce already prepared or with those new ideas already infiltrating the workforce. They have a good opportunity to make a huge difference in the workforce because they are so inspired, they are so enthusiastic, and three factors stand out. This is a very confident generation. They have a lot of expectations as well. I mean, what we are doing today shows really, 20 years ago, you wouldn't really have young people gathering here to talk about some of these developmental challenges and trying to find their niche and their contribution within that sphere. So the fact that you've gathered and found time to discuss these matters really point to the fact that you have huge expectations. Number three is also, you are achievement oriented. You just don't want to do things for the sake of doing them. You want to see progress. You want to see things changing. It's not a matter of business as usual. And most importantly is that this group, they have grown up in a time of rapid change. And this has given the millennials a set of priorities and expectations that is sharply different from the previous generations. You've had to really grapple with a lot of things. I mean, if you told stories with some of your uncles and I think your grandfathers at this stage, they will tell you that during their time, entering a high school was a guarantee that you will get a job, and qualifying for university was like the best asset in the world. But today, you will notice that even holding a master's degree will still not guarantee you anything. Even a PhD might not guarantee you anything in terms of the formal academic qualification, but also learning on the job, going for internships, going for attachments. There's no guarantee. Years back, when you went for an attachment, you are as good as absorbed in that employment. So these are realities that you are living with. And so anything you do in any sector is really informed by such kind of realities and the fact that things have changed rapidly and you have to navigate to be able to get what you want out of this. Now, these expectations are actually enshrined or rather they were also kind of talked about much in the Agenda 2030, which recognizes that young people have a strong ability to drive change. More than 1/3 of the Sustainable Development Goals also target involvement of youth, explicitly or implicitly in different ways. But most importantly, young people are often the group most affected by changes within their communities, as I've just illustrated. A good example is sometime back in 2018, the World Benchmarking Alliance, asked youth some few questions. And one of them was, what do you feel is the #1 priority to make the world a better place in 2030? And the answers, if your guess is as good as mine, is quite interesting. As much as the young people are seen to be quite, consumer oriented and they want some of the best in the world, they are concerned about their environment. 52% of the respondents stated they're concerned about a sustainable environment, a sustainable society, and a sustainable economy. So you can see that economy really doesn't rank highest as would have been expected. And this is something that we must take advantage of if we really want to make the world if we want to make the future better for us, because the interest in the sustainability of both the environment and the society is quite key, because human beings are the ones who are degrading the environment. And if we realize there's concern that they want a safer environment, a clean environment, and a sustainable society, then that gives us a good opportunity. The other chart simply draws on what the Chinese respondents felt, because they were also interested in gauging what's happening in that continent. But most importantly, if we take away the Chinese contribution, that's the third chart, it simply shows the numbers haven't changed much, but now sustainable society and environment seem to be at par. And that's quite interesting, because it means the workforce we have, the society we have, is quite critical on matters sustainability. But that sustainability is actually strongly linked to matters environment. And this is a good realization, because sustainability is about the interconnectivity between the three: economy, society, and the environment. And that gives us, as environmentalists, a very good standing if we want to move forward. But beyond that, Harvard Business Review also conducted a study, and their concerns were around matters that millennials are concerned about when it comes to workplace or work ethics. And so the question of, if you are able to choose your manager, which of the following would be most important to you? Someone who empowers their employees, someone who is a technical or a functional expert in their field, who sets transparent performance criteria, is a role model, or gives me goal-oriented work. And interestingly, particularly for Africa, empowerment became a big issue. And I think if those of you are here who attended the discussion we had last week, under the auspice of AWF, there was a lot of talk of how do we engage youth in conservation and development matters. And there was a lot of emphasis on, empowerment, on support, on, the elderly team trying to work alongside the younger people to learn the ropes. So this empowerment bit seems to be quite prominent in our concerns. But also the issue of goal orientation, as well as technical and functional expertise. So most of the young people then are looking for somebody they can look up to. They are eager to learn from the existing expertise, but they are also eager to be guided through these processes. Now, these are opportunities that if we have got non-millennials listening today, I think those are opportunities you can really capture to be able to mainstream youth in our activities. Besides that, when it comes to questions...
Tobias.
Okay, are we together?
Yes, we are.
Right, so the previous slides that I've discussed were basically looking at some of the key characteristics and the aspirations of the millennials, and why I say they're quite critical when we discuss matters environment and development, because that is where all the resources and the foundations for development really originate. Now, one critical thing that Usman actually established was that the millennials are the first generation that has witnessed the rapid degradation of crucial ecosystems at a global scale. And if you remember in the first slide, I talked about the millennials being the group that is growing up at a time when there's rapid change. Now, one of the rapid changes is the rapid degradation of crucial ecosystems at a global scale. And of course, you will witness that at local level, we also have similar issues. For example, next slide, click. So matters of biodiversity, particularly, both terrestrial, marine, as well as freshwater species, there has been a steady decline from the 1970s. And within that time, at around 1980, you can see there's been a very, clear decline in biodiversity. And this is something that has really affected, most of the ecosystem services that we depend on. And because the millennials have actually grown up along this period of time, there might have been certain observations that you've made that either have formed your opinion or you have raised concerns that you really feel needs to be addressed. The next slide. Another issue is the loss of forest cover, for example, and this is in the DRC Congo between 2002 and 2018. So in your lifetime, as you see these things happening, and perhaps you're not in control. Similar trends were actually observed in the Amazon, where a similar study was conducted, and the trends are equally the same. And these are two main, forests which are key carbon sinks in the two continents, and therefore such kind of losses really impact heavily on the quality of the environment, as well as the quality of ecosystem services that we derive from this, environment. Next. Matters of climate change. As a result of such kind of massive losses and, influx of development investment, which we'll see next, issues of climate change have really been accelerated, particularly global warming and other climatic conditions. And this example we have here is just showing the rising global temperature from observed, which you can see steadily going up. It's approaching 3 degrees Celsius, whereas the IPCC projections are also showing a similar trend in rise. So definitely there's something that is happening, and this is between 2000 and it's projected up to 2050. So within your lifetime, and remember we said in 2030, we have the youths who will be occupying 75% of the workforce. The question is, this is happening in your lifetime. This is going to affect your productivity and your workforce. What is it that can be done to address that without waiting for maybe future directions? And beyond that, the next thing, accompanying that is the massive urbanization, global urbanization. The projections are very clear that huge human populations are shifting towards urbanization. And the projections are that by 2030, you could see that about 38% of lower middle income countries, whereas low income countries will have almost close to that same figure, 47%, 60%, 74%. And of course, the biggest concern is the high income countries, where 83% or rather 84% will actually be in the urban areas by 2030. And you can see the projections in 2050 is still pretty high. Now, what does that mean? We all know the impacts of rapid urbanization in terms of natural resource depletion, in terms of demand for energy, in terms of demand for other resources, infrastructure. This is all going to be quite critical, as we see in the next slide. In order to address this, then there's always the push for human development. And some examples include, what's happening in Africa now with the Chinese road and One Road and Belt initiative. And the push towards this is to try and expand infrastructure in order to facilitate international and regional, connectivity, as well as cultural integration. Now, what this means is that more space is needed to invest, more open spaces are going to be occupied, and more, prime areas are going to be degraded in order to provide this opportunity. The next picture shows agriculture expansion. And as a result of that, in order to meet the demand for food production, there's going to be a huge expansion of agricultural land. And I think if you're familiar with the biodiversity maps, you will notice that most of those regions which are having close to 91 to 100%, expansion of agricultural land are the same places that are also rich in biodiversity. And that is quite telling, because it means there's going to be a replacement of critical biodiversity. There's going to be loss of critical areas of key biodiversity areas, and species are going to disappear. And so for us in conservation, we think that something must be done, and that must be done within your lifetime, because these are projections going up to 2050, when some of the people currently involved in mitigation might not be there to witness. So in the spirit of sustainable development, which is talk about the future generations, that future is actually now. And these are things you must recognize and be able to start thinking deeply about how to reverse them in a manner that is sustainable, but also meeting that need for population that is expanding. Next. So in response to that, some of the things that have happened is the expansion of infrastructure, particularly in Africa, for instance, which has never had much of the infrastructure before. And I think the map that I've shown there shows how much connected the entire continent is by road transport as well as by sea. These are measures that are in place to facilitate connectivity, to facilitate trade, and to facilitate investment. The observation behind it is that it's supposed to enhance poverty reduction, enhance economic development, enhance government as well as local populations to be able to achieve their aspirations, but at the expense of natural ecosystems. But these are realities. And the reason I'm talking of this is that we cannot pretend that these things cannot happen. They have to happen because human development must occur. But we think about it in a sustainable manner. Is it resilient to climate change? Is it inclusive? Is it something that's sustainable? That's the kind of discourse we need to think about, other than thinking about all these investments being negative. A good example is the next chart that shows how much of this infrastructure is actually spread across the continent. And so in this study in 2016 by Lawrence et al., they were interested in knowing establishing some of the impacts of this infrastructure on ecosystems. And so out of 33, what we are calling corridors that they assessed, there was a clear indication that they affected a number of key biodiversity areas. They affected a number of key wildlife and biodiversity, or rather wildlife and both fauna and floral species. A lot of ecosystem degradation was reported. And this was as late as 2016, when the Belt and Road Initiative actually started taking place. And so the concern, therefore, is that the trend is not going to stop. It's going to proceed, but we need to plug ourselves in that trend and see how we can direct it. The problem is sometimes we sit aside and let those who are involved in development decision-making proceed with their decisions, and then we complain later. It is time that we recognize what's going on and plug ourselves in between to ensure that we give direction in a manner that can ensure that those projects are implemented sustainably. Let's proceed. Coming home to Kenya, we've seen lots of examples. If as late as 2014, you could see that up to 31 million were really not connected to to electricity, and yet one of the issues of development was to demand that people have got access to energy and power connectivity in order to be more innovative and invest. And that's quite interesting because as the millennials, again, you must ask yourself, if this population doesn't have access, how are we going to be innovative? How are we going to compete globally? And that means in your mind, you really have to support development. But ask yourself, at what cost? Right now, for instance, with the COVID, you realize that most of the education, most of the teaching in our universities have actually resorted to being online. The question then is, how many of that population is able to access online facilities? If they are not able to access, then what is missing? Now, that which is missing is the concern of government to ensure that it is put in place. And putting in place means that they might have to compromise some of the environmental qualities, some of the environmental integrity in order to provide for that immediate need. However, if we are able to identify and recognize better ways of doing it, then we are able to direct towards a green or towards an environmentally sustainable or eco-friendly investment in those sectors. And as you can see in the next slide, where now Kenya has invested in the LabSet as well as the SGR, we've had a lot of issues with these projects in Kenya. And I think all of you must have really witnessed, particularly those in Nairobi and Mombasa, Savo areas of Voi. People have demonstrated, people have complained about the imminent destruction that's going to arise from these projects. However, there's never been good evidence to really demonstrate that they are going to affect these ecosystems. And where the evidence has been, it's never been articulated properly. And I think you will agree with me that most of our colleagues in the government, those who make the decisions, those who are involved in projects like this, will always perceive those of us in the conservation sector as anti-development. As a millennial, you really have to understand those politics and be sure that you are not branded as anti-development, but you are branded as somebody who is conscious of the need or the synergies between development and environment. These projects being implemented are not being implemented for other people. They are being implemented for the citizens, including you and me. The only problem is the implementation has not been informed by solid and concrete data to inform how they implement it. So matters of sustainability might have been overlooked. Matters of resilience, matters of participation, matters of representation might have been overlooked because we've never found a way to work together and we've never understood the interactions between environment and development. They have to support each other, they have to complement each other, but they don't have to compete with each other. Next. So that one, I just wanted us to, see what's going on. I mean, people have raised these concerns. They are not new to us. Perhaps the media, the approach, the way we've done it is what might have been problematic. So my challenge, therefore, is that for a new millennial group that wants to engage effectively, you really must find more, friendlier or more sustainable media where you can engage with the decision makers based on evidence, not just, demonstrating. And when you are called upon to show us your alternatives, then nobody shows up. We have evidence of where, the same people we demonstrate against have invited us to the table for discussions. And suddenly we don't show up, or a few of us show up and we realize we don't have any evidence and we start saying, well, we've read somewhere or we've heard somewhere and eventually we are considered irrelevant. And that's not just happening locally. A number of us have stated that we've attended some of these international conferences, some of these international, fora where negotiations are done. And you see the kind of contingent we carry along, we become a laughing stock, sorry to say that, because when other countries bring on board technical people who can quickly think on their feet and bring on board very critical discourses, our team carry people who are interested in joyriding and being seen. I was sitting at Davos for this and this conference, and when we come back home, we are on the streets demonstrating over the same things we were called upon to go and negotiate. So the young people need to realize those kind of realities and engage in a meaningful manner, learn from your colleagues from other areas who are always winning because they engage with a more informed perspective as opposed to joyriding and posting that we attended this and this conference, but what was the meaningful outcome that really we could be proud of? And that is transcending itself into these projects that I've shown here. We engage with a lot of media attention, but substance and proper engagement is always missing. And so we keep on firefighting when projects have been initiated. Next slide. So therefore, we might think that nothing is really happening or something has never been done, but I would really want us to draw attention to the history. From the 70s, a lot has really been done in order to try and reconcile the disagreements between conservation and development. But it will be important for us to understand how those histories have evolved, particularly from the time when they were running parallel. Click on that. Next, Tony. Yeah, so you can see that from as early as 1940s, already the conservation development, discourse and the push and pull had begun. So it's not something that just started the other day. However, there was a lot of parallelism. What the Liz Roy calls phase one. Those in conservation were busy doing their things. Those in development were busy doing their things, interested in economic growth. Whereas for us, we were concerned about species and habitat conservation. And so this kind of, notion went on for quite some time, for over 30 years, up to the 1970s, when UNESCO raised, alarm through their Man and Biosphere program. And this started bringing issues of conservation, matters being given, interest, particularly the rights, local rights, or rights of people who are living in some of these protected areas, whom were felt to be, disenfranchised. But still at that phase two, the development guys were still quite indifferent, but they started considering that, environmental quality is actually a factor, and therefore whenever environment was degraded, they felt they were not achieving their goals. So that kind of awareness started coming on board, so that by 1980 and 1990, there was going to be some kind of convergence. As you can see, there was the thinking that for us to address the needs of the locals, then the community aspirations must be incorporated. But also the guys on the development thought, if we want to develop, if we want to initiate projects for the people, then they must be involved in the process. So you can see in the development team, they thought about participatory development or decentralization, letting market forces come into place, as opposed to dictating what is happening. Whereas those of us in conservation thought, let's think about bringing communities on board. And so community-based conservation, as well as sustainable use of resources issues, started to emerge in the 1980s and 1990s. And so around 1997, you can see that things really merged together, so that issues of sustainable development as well as community-based natural resource management merged together because they realized their goals were actually coming together. But I think there wasn't still much of learning at that stage. It was more or less on paper or rhetoric, but the actual implementation was still a problem. And so you'd see that in the 2000s, a lot of things have happened, particularly in the conservation side. You can see back to back from 2000, 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all through. There were lots of international conventions, lots of international meetings, agreements coming in, congresses coming in to try and address some of these issues. And there was a lot of focus on issues of human rights, particularly how these were handled by the conservation NGOs in the Global South. Whereas the development side, they also thought about the issues of poverty reduction coming on board, transition to direct budget support. So you can see in phase 4, again, these two discourses are trying to pull apart. And that wasn't very nice. So that in phase 5, when now we have the millennials, you people are on the ground, there's still a lot of misunderstanding. People haven't really thought on how best to integrate these. And it is a discourse that is still ongoing. Every side feels they haven't really nailed it. And now the issues of climate change came on board, and you find yourself now grappling with a new threat in terms of how climate change is affecting conservation and development. And perhaps this might offer a new platform for us to think about integrating those in a meaningful manner as opposed to what has been done before. And in the next slide, which we won't really discuss at length, it simply tries to summarize that again in a different way. Now looking at 3 strands, from the conservation, NGOs and local people's perspectives and how that has evolved. The second line is about conservation policy and protectionism. People wanting to do things for themselves as opposed to people putting in place policies that ensure prosperity. And of course, the third strand looks at biodiversity and development policy. So how have the people, particularly those in development arena, incorporated biodiversity issues in their development policies? The recognition that for us to achieve development, then environment is central, biodiversity is central, natural resources must be protected. And in the next slide, we then think about where is the turning point now? And this now I'm speaking to you people because at this stage now is where we think, why do we see a lot of activism, or why do we see some bit of indifference, particularly amongst the millennials? Now, the fact that you grew up within this environment, you experienced some of these challenges, you experienced some of these rapid, changes in your environment, they actually help to form your thinking. They help to motivate or to create some kind of inquisitiveness in you that what really changed and why did it change and how did it change? And that brought into you something we can call, what can I do to address this? And I think that's where we are today as the young people. What can we do to address those changes, recognizing that something has already been done? So we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We do not want to repeat what has been done. How do we do them differently? Next. So the reason for that is very clear, that despite all those conventions and all the nice agreements in place and policies, something seems to be happening. We are not achieving any meaningful goals. So this chart again shows us the changes that have occurred in terms of biodiversity. Based on the same biodiversity index we used at the beginning, the trend has always been that the biodiversity is in decline. And this seems not to be changing. And if you see from can't see what is down there, but of course you can see that the projections or the extrapolations are actually showing that going up to 2050, something really needs to be done. And it's giving us three scenarios: either business as usual, the middle section, or we continue with more deterioration, the red one, or we think about going green. We think about changing how we do business, how we conduct things, the green one. And I believe the automatic choice for you is the green one. All of us really want to see a change. All of us want to see things done differently. The only problem is the mechanism. How do we do that? What options do we have as young people? How do we engage? Do we have an understanding of the interactions between environment and development, in the sense that we talk about sustainability? And I think in the next slide, it should be bringing us almost there. So this slide then offers us some options. Where do we get the trade-offs? How do we identify where we might be facing some bottlenecks? In most cases, we tend to consider our participation or involvement as what I can call unidimensional. But you have to think about these things as being multidimensional. They are multifaceted. The fact that I'm interested in conservation does not in any way mean that I don't want to eat food. And that's where we've got lots of conflicts between people imagining that local communities who are destroying forests are destroying just for the sake of it. Far from it. They're destroying because they must put food on their table. So understanding how all these dynamics, how they interact, how they impact on each other, really is quite critical if we want to make some meaningful contribution. And so this paper by Campbell really gave me, by Romero, sorry, gave me a very nice summary of what I had in mind and perhaps what I thought we needed to discuss as some of the options to engage. So it's got those 6 components, from interactions with social actors, governance and participation, politics, information exchange, economic issues, natural resource characteristics, and how they interact with themselves, and also interact with conservation and development, and therefore either enhancing sustainability or not. And I think in the previous slides, you've seen how the 2 strands of development and conservation have actually pulled with each other. And perhaps some of these things that I've listed here might have been the contributing factors. Issues of politics, issues of lack of information or otherwise, economic demands, natural resource characteristics. Some of them are very sensitive, some of them are quite resilient, some of them are quite, they need special attention or they are impacted differently. Who are the social actors involved? Do we involve all of them, or do we act like we know it all ourselves? Governance and participation. Who are the people who are brought to the table for negotiations, and do they understand, do they represent the same needs that they talk about? So the issues of tensions between conservation and development can then provide us an opportunity, particularly as the millennials, to find ourselves filling in those gaps. As you said initially, the millennials have got the expertise, they are more experienced, they are internationally exposed, and they are quite innovative. How do we innovate to plug into those gaps that really need attention? So in the last slide, we'll just quickly look a little bit into those components, starting with the first one. natural resource characteristics. Now, what does this mean? We simply make reference to types of resources that we have access to, their natural services that they provide, and the kinds and intensities of use, stress, and disturbance regimes to which they are subjected. Now, this is quite critical. We've seen cases where, communities living with wildlife, for instance, have experienced human-wildlife conflict. And so their reaction is to either retaliate by injuring or harming some of these animals, some of them even kill. Whereas some of us who live maybe in the forested locations where we do not have wild animals, we start asking, why are they killing lions? Why are they hostile to elephants? On the reverse, we have got communities who live in dry areas like Savo, Voi, for instance. They don't have forests, and they wish they had forests there. And so when they hear communities, for instance, in Mukogodo or Mount Kenya destroying forests, they start asking questions. Why are they doing that? Don't they know the value of these forests? Now, we really must understand these characteristics, what they do in our ecosystems. Why do we tolerate them around us? Because we know that close to 90% of the African population depends or derive their livelihoods on their natural ecosystem. And therefore, if you can't stop them from doing that, then you are telling them your livelihoods don't matter. So it's upon you and me to think about innovative ways to ensure that they still sustain their livelihoods from these natural resources, but we are aware of the kind of intensities and use that these resources can withstand. What sort of disturbance regimes can they withstand, and how do we address those in a more structured manner, as opposed to just telling them you can't, and yet they have to. So what we come up with is actually issues of illegal grazing, illegal forest, destruction of forests. And this is not what you want if you want a sustainable society, if you want a sustainable environment. The next one, we talked about interactions of social actors. So who are these people? How is negotiation done among particularly government agencies and the individual citizens, as well as the resource users? How do we engage these people? So giving that same example I've mentioned, you are a forester, you've learned that people in Mount Kenya forest are destroying forests, and you simply go there and say, you are arrested, this is not going to happen. So you are turning local sustainable forest resource users into illegal forest users. Now, what is going to happen is then the negotiations are broken down, and now you start what you can call the arms race. You are now chasing them back and forth, and the attitudes and perceptions begin to change, and then you suffer from lack of support. If we are able to identify how these actors engage, how do we represent each other, how do we negotiate some of these resource use regimes, chances are we are likely to get some better outcomes, as opposed to instituting regulations that sometimes are not participatory in nature. And the next point is then telling us about participation. This encompasses various formal and informal institutions and policies that affect land and natural resource tenure, natural resource access and use rights, human rights, provisions, and access to social services. Several of these, basically what this refers to is, how do we plug ourselves into the existing institutions, and where they do not exist, how do we create new ones? And these new ones must be driven by the fact that we recognize the participation of the people involved. And this is where the challenge is. For those of us who have worked a little bit in the community projects, when we talk about participation, sometimes we become so myopic in the sense that we believe whoever we've selected from that community is representing that community, and therefore that community has participated in the process. Participation must be anchored on what you call equity. Participation must be anchored on proper representation. The fact that you've got people from community X sitting with you does not mean they represent that community X. They might be representing different interests. And for you, as somebody who wants to see meaningful change, you must be aware of that. So the process of recruitment, the process of negotiations, the process of ensuring equitable participation must be informed by proper access to different resources and different capabilities that's going to help them make meaningful contribution. A good example is with the environmental impact assessments, where we've seen people, and this actually in the public domain, where I'm going to conduct an EIA for a project in somewhere in Narok, and because I know a few friends from Narok who live in Nairobi, who are my friends, I simply pay them fares and we meet in Narok town, and we sit in Narok town and have a meeting for a whole day, and we come back to Nairobi. In my mind, or in my thinking, the Narok citizens' interests have been taken care of. Why? Because the participants in my meetings were actually from Narok County. Well, the problem is, whose interests were they representing? Did they engage with the communities before they came on board to be sure that what they are saying is the voices of the communities? Or do they assume that because they are elites in Nairobi, they then understand best what their community wants back in the rural? And this is one of the pitfalls that you as a millennial must watch. A number of us have become what you call the elites. We suffer from what you can call elite capture. We believe that because I'm a Maasai with a degree, any issues of Maasai, I am the professional who can understand them. Or we believe that because I'm a project manager from the Maasai land and I'm managing a conservation project, I know more about conservation, and so you don't need to go talk to the people in the grassroots. Just ask me the questions. Now, that is something that we've seen happening a lot, and the elites, particularly the millennials, must desist from that. You really have to understand what is meant by meaningful participation, because at the end of the day, you will fall in the same pit that you are trying to walk away from. Issues of representation, governance, and participation must be critically assessed. And the fourth point is about politics. And when we talk about politics here, we have to differentiate this from governance, because politics is basically that process that influences the identification of synergies between and the implementation of environmental, conservation, and sustainable development. So it reflects power relations and their dynamics. In other words, it's a question of who gets what and why are they getting it? Who decides when something is supposed to be done and why are they deciding it? So the relationship, as a millennial, we mentioned at the beginning, you might be interested in being empowered, in building your capacity to do something. But then you've not made a decision, or you've not identified who determines who can be given that opportunity. Once you've understood those kind of dynamics, once you've understood who decides what, where, and how, then you are going to be quite safe, because you will know whom to engage in order for your interests or those needs that you want addressed to be addressed. But otherwise, it would be very suicidal to just attack some of these challenges head on without being critical as to what happens. That actually constitutes what we call political ecology, understanding the economics, the social, as well as the politics of conservation. How do they interact? How do people make decisions? How do they make rules? How are these regulations arrived at? Who determines what gets what? You really have to engage with that and understand. And some of these things you really can learn through continuous engagement with the resources, with the professionals, continuous engagement with the practice, that's either in development as well as conservation, and being open to the discourses from both sides of the divide. If you say, I'm a conservationist, I love Nairobi National Park, any discussion with somebody who wants to put up a resort city inside Nairobi Park is non-negotiable. Then suppose those in development also says, I'm not negotiating with anybody. We definitely are not going anywhere. We really must think about how to identify those synergies and compromise where it's necessary and inform each other. The next slide then tells us that we can't do this without access to information. We really must have clear information, evidence, data, knowledge, skills. You cannot go to a negotiating table if you're not informed, if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have the data to kind of support your claims. And so we've lost out, particularly those of us in conservation, we've lost out because we have the information sometimes, but we don't give it out, or we don't have that information and we don't go out of our way to get alternative information, or we've stuck to one line of argument. I know about elephants. That is all I know. They need enough, huge space for their, foraging and livelihoods. I don't want anything to do with somebody blocking that route. The question is, those in other sectors also have got evidence showing that if they put, for instance, the SGR through Nairobi National Park, it was going to be beneficial. And they are giving you their data with trends, with all the, evidence. And for you, you're shouting and calling the media to cover you and you go back home. You've wasted your time. Can you also present your data? Show us the implications, show us the impacts. Can you be more, diverse? Don't be monodisciplinary. Some of us just talk about ecology up to evening. When you get somebody who's multidisciplinary, they challenge you in your field, which is ecology, and they have additional facts in terms of development discourse. So you end up being irrelevant because you are stuck with one line of argument and you lost the argument. You become very, very bitter and you end up on street. We don't want that. We want people to negotiate, engage, and do that based on sustainable, on existing evidence that can be defended, that you believe in and you are sure it is making sense. And finally, if you take care of all this, some of the pressures are actually coming from external factors like the formal and informal markets. You are familiar with the issues of poaching, as well as the markets in China. I'll not go into that, but you are also familiar with the demands for investment. We have got the standard gauge railway in Kenya now as a big problem, and the LAPSET project, and as I showed in that map, they are all traversing key protected and community conservation areas. At what stage do we engage with people who are negotiating investment? Because to them, building a road to access Turkana oil fields is critical. Passing through a small conservancy in Isiolo is really not a big issue. So how do we understand those kind of external pressures and how they shape the way decisions are made outside our realms? And that takes me back to the same process that we've talked about throughout. We do not know where those things happen because we do not read widely, or we do not engage outside your comfort zones. We must get out of our comfort zones and understand when the Chinese government and the Kenyan government negotiate for the standard gauge railway, what does that mean for me in conservation? What does that mean for those in development? Where am I likely to lose, and how do I plug myself in that process? We wait until it is done, and we start negotiating when things have already been done, and we are left with a very small portion to get on board. So if we understand all that process and we plug ourselves at the earliest opportunity, it should really work for us. And that's a challenge for the millennials, because you are engaging with more enlightened society, more innovative society, a society that is more capitalist in thinking. And they always look for opportunities in every available space. You are familiar with the discourse that was going on around Nairobi National Park in terms of people saying all this space is being wasted just for wildlife. We can put nice skyscrapers here, we can put nice industries here. That is their thinking. How about you as a conservationist? You tell me elephants need space, so what? What is the value of elephants to this economist, to this investor? Are you able to link the existence of elephants and the decline in tourism revenue and the decline in international revenue? If you are able to make those dots and connect them nicely, you might win the case. But if you're not able, you're just stuck with one line of, this is the best park we have in the world, it cannot be degraded. Then they keep asking for your evidence. They give you examples from other countries where these things have happened. You are only stuck with Nairobi. My friend, you're losing out. So as millennials, for us to be relevant, for us to be seen to be taking things differently, we must engage in a different discourse from the normal rhetoric, from the normal way of doing things in a manner that's going to make us more relevant and being listened to. And finally, in way of concluding, I think it's important, my thinking therefore is that millennials have a clear role to play in the conservation development debate, as well as policy environment and practical action. But there's need to appreciate the historical context and evolution of environment development duality to be more effective in the 21st century conservation and development arena. In doing this, we need to appreciate the competing needs for human development. Governments are under pressure to meet the basic needs of their populations. So for us to, and also to remain relevant in the global development race, I've given an example of the China Road and Belt Initiative. Which country would want to be left out of such investment? Definitely no. Right now we have the COVID pandemic issue, and the World Bank and other international donors are giving out funding to support that. If this was going to be detrimental to conservation and you stand on the way, you really have to give good evidence why you think taking that money for investment is not good enough. And you must be very articulate at that. They also want to ensure sustainability at local level. They don't want to be seen to be losing. And if you're familiar with our politics particularly, you will realize that everything is geared towards making the electorate happy. And so if you don't understand those dynamics, the politics and how that fits into your discourse, then you are going to be stuck with a discourse that people see you as irrelevant. If you keep telling the president, you can't do this, and you don't offer him alternatives, then he's going to tell you, my friend, I've got votes to protect. So if you are not helping me get my votes, then you are irrelevant to me. So we really have to think like them and then try to see what alternatives they have. Now, the millennials, inspired by the goals of sustainability, can offer energy, enthusiasm, diversity to offer leadership in the sustainability debate. However, they must explore different tools, technologies, approaches to be more effective. We cannot do things in the business as usual manner. There must be some creativity, and there must be a different approach to doing things. It's never going to be confrontational. It's going to be the battle of the brains. And so you must educate yourself, inform yourself, and identify very critical but relevant areas of engagement. The example I've given in terms of those pillars, they offer a simple approach to understand and appreciate these dynamics. And I think it's something that really we can build on as a starting point. But that is not just the one direction of thinking. As an example I gave, there are different ways of looking at it, but my emphasis is you really must be very clear on what you want, how you want it done, and what your contribution to it is. Last. Good. So I think those are just some of the people I work with in the project I'm running now, which is Development Corridors Partnership. And what we are trying to look at is the impacts of the SGR and LAPSET on social and ecological systems. And guess what? We are looking at the impacts after they have been done. And that is the same pitfall that we might find going forward, that we are always running after development because we do not know the appropriate time to engage. And when we do engage at the appropriate time, we don't have the proper evidence and the data and the expertise to engage. Some of us are so scientific, and yet those in development thinks from a very different direction. So it's very important that we really think dynamically, but also be able to educate ourselves to go beyond simple rhetoric. Thank you so much for listening. I think, Tony, if we can now get down to some discussion, please.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for that insightful presentation. I am seated on my seat and I'm just really happy about it so far. So I'll just ask those in attendance to, if they have any questions, they can, because we are only 10 people, so it's a bit, it's slow. So if anybody has a question, just unmute.
Yes, Tony.
Yes.
Yes, this is Vincent. Tobias,
Hi,
thank
Vincent.
you for, hello? Yes. Tobias, thank you for that informative presentation. I have one question on development. Before this development take place, for example, the SGR, was there like a strategic environmental assessment done before? And was there a biodiversity action plan put for these projects? Because this can be used to conserve biodiversity in these areas.
Well, thank you so much. And that's a very good question, and I was hoping somebody would ask it. And that's where I've been frustrated a lot, and I think it's one area that you guys must also really come in strongly. Number one, the evidence I have shows that the environmental and social impact assessments were conducted for both phase 1 and phase 2 of the SGR, including the section that passed through the Nairobi National Park. That is the fact. It was done. But what wasn't followed is the process. And that's very critical, because if the process is not followed to the letter, then the result is invalid. So what we have as the report is actually showing very interesting findings and very interesting things that were discussed, but they were done after the process of construction of the SGR was already ongoing. And therefore it wasn't done to inform the process of SGR construction, but it was done, in my opinion, to tick the boxes. That if you ask a question like you've asked now, we can refer you to the document. Here it is. Are you happy? Get out of our way. And the second thing is that with the new projects emerging along the SGR, it happens that most of those recommendations in that document have actually not been adhered to, apart from the few that were quite sector specific, particularly within Tsavo national parks, both Tsavo East and West, where through the KWS and other conservation NGOs, there was a lot of pressure to ensure that ecosystem connectivity was enhanced, particularly leaving space for wildlife to move between East and West. If you come to Nairobi National Park, again, some of that was followed, particularly to ensure that the entire SGR within the park was raised for the entire 7 kilometers. And then the noise reflectors added to ensure that it doesn't disturb wildlife. the success of that is yet to be seen. But in other areas where there were no strict, lobbying for adherence to environmental and social needs, nothing was done. And so you have got places like in Narok area where households have been divided or broken down into two, or parcels of land have been broken down into pieces because the SGR runs right through the middle. And so a household or a man is left on one side of the SGR and one or two of his wives are on the other side of the SGR. Now, these are some of the challenges that people can dispute because it can be considered a matter of personal decision. But I think in a country where we want to be accountable both socially and ecologically, we have to offer tangible alternatives. We don't coerce or we don't appear to be, enforcing without considering some of the better alternatives. So in a nutshell, the EIAs and the SEIAs were done for these projects, but for most of them, they were done after the project was ongoing, and so their input cannot really be verified to be accurate.
Yes, thank you for that, Tobias. And as you mentioned that development and conservation are both important.
Yes.
So while doing this, there's this thing on mitigation hierarchy for these big projects. Are they really being followed?
Yes. Well, the mitigation hierarchy is quite critical. Unfortunately, it's not been taken up as a legal requirement in Kenya. So what we have in Kenya is certain organizations that have been funded, particularly by the IFC, are currently implementing it, like the Kipeto power plant. They're implementing that because it is a requirement for them to access funding from IFC. But all the other projects, including SGR, that is not funded by the IFC or World Bank, have got no obligation whatsoever to follow that. So what we've done previously under the Development Corridors Partnership Project is to try and build capacity. So in February last year, we held a training for mostly EIA experts to try and introduce the concept of mitigation hierarchy to them and see if it is something that can be mainstreamed or escalated into, a requirement by most of these people to implement. As it were, a 1 day or 2 days of training cannot be treated as a professional development, and therefore you really can't say that these people are now professional. So from where I sit, we still lack critical expertise on mitigation hierarchy in terms of how it can be designed and implemented to ensure that those projects are environmentally sustainable. Within the DCP, I've got a colleague who is actually working on trying to see how it can be implemented in the country. But until then, I can't be confident that any of these projects, other than the ones funded by IFC, are actually implementing that. And just for those who don't know about mitigation hierarchy, it's a very interesting tool. It's very important when it comes to environmental accountability, particularly where some of these mega projects are being implemented. It can act in complementarity to EIA process, but it's more scientific, it's more evidence-based, and I think because it is more, hierarchy-based, it means you cannot bypass one and go to the other without justifying why the first stage has not been implemented. So it is something we might want to think about going forward on how this can be mainstreamed to ensure that, our projects are actually adhering to some of these international standards.
So, why is it not a requirement by the government for it to be followed?
Well, the matters of environmental impact assessment or masters of environmental and social safeguards is actually enshrined into the government laws through MCA. And MCA provides provisions for environmental and social impact assessment. And of course, the guidelines provide very specific procedures to be followed. And it happens that mitigation hierarchy is not one of them. So what has happened, again, as you know, mitigation hierarchy is not a very old concept in the country. And so it's never been, incorporated in the government legislation. So what we think, or what we are recommending as DCP now, is how mitigation hierarchy can be mainstreamed into law, can be mainstreamed into policy, so that it becomes a requirement. At the moment, I can assure you it is all voluntary. Only projects that wish they want to meet those international standards engage with that, and because they perhaps want to get additional funding from international, donors that require that. But for projects that are government to government, like the ones supported by the Chinese government, where there's no strict adherence to some of those environmental standards, they don't really have to do that. And it's not a requirement by law, so you can't even prosecute them for that.
Yeah, thank you. I have one last question. It's on the millennials.
Yes.
These young people they have a mindset of having a lot of money very fast.
Yes.
And do anything very fast. When you ask them in an interview, can you do this thing? They'll tell you, yes, I can do it. They'll go down and Google how to do it, and they'll come up with a concept and present it to you. Fora like this are very critical in awareness creation to the youth. Do you think these fora are very good, and are there other strategies that can be used in including the youth to conservation and development?
Well, definitely. I think your observation about the impatience, I think I mentioned in my first slide that the millennials are quite impatient, particularly when it comes to things that don't work the way they want at the same speed. And my thinking is that, it's a natural thing. Everybody's impatient. They want to make money. They want to live better. But like you rightly point, to what extent do we ensure integrity when we are pursuing those kind of goals? Because if I asked you to come for an interview and then you Google a concept and bring to me, well, I think that's not right. And in terms of how you can also, enhance integrity, it means we've already lost it from the word go, because we are now bringing a generation of deception, a generation that doesn't believe in hard work, honestly, and accountability. So how then is this generation going to take over in 10 years' time to lead the nation to prosperity? So I think this kind of fora is quite important for us to speak openly to each other and learn or share lessons from other continents. I mean, we are in the era of globalization, and there's no way we are going to remain static. A good example is, where people, for instance, cheat in exams, and we celebrate that. And yet when they fail to get scholarships to compete globally, we complain about that. Now, these are issues that really do not require somebody else to tell you, but it requires an individual to take steps towards being honest and transparent in achieving their goals. Now, this kind of fora is quite critical, because if we are able to share those aspirations and commit to making a difference, then we can make a difference based on, knowledge and based on awareness of the reality. These are the real challenges, and so we might not get what we want as fast as we wanted. The other strategy that I think would work for us is, we have to appreciate that sometimes when you do something for long, or you gain what I would call experience, you become better at doing your work. So when you see people who are performing very well out there, don't start imagining that they left college yesterday and they became professors or they became professionals in their field. Some of them have spent years and years learning the trade, and so they have become better with age. If you appreciate that, then as a millennial, then you understand the process. You have an advantage of access to so many platforms to learn some of these tricks, as opposed to the older generation. So understanding the role of aligning yourself with the existing projects, for instance, looking for attachments, looking for mentorships, learning from those who have gone through these processes can really help you, become better at what you're doing. But guess what? You are learning from them, but not at the same pace as they did. Because for you today, if I ask you to prepare for me, let's say a research concept, it might take you just 1 week and I have a document on my table. Whereas those years, preparing a research concept could take a whole year, because you have to go to the library, read those books, take notes by handwriting, go and type them in a typewriter somewhere, print it out and bring it to me, and then I make corrections and get back to you. It takes a whole lot of period to succeed, whereas in your case, you have technology to make things go faster. You only need to be honest in that process to ensure that you commit to learning the best practices while doing what you're doing. So I think, to me, it's not a question of doing it faster, but it's a question of doing it properly with honesty and integrity.
Thank you very much, Tom. It was very much informative. Yes.
Thank you. Anybody else with a question? We'll take 2 or 3, and then we can call it a wrap.
Thank you very much. My name is Damaris.
Sure, go on.
Thanks so much, Tobias, for bringing in this particular discussion. I think it's a very timely one at this particular point in time when we are dealing a lot in the country and also globally when it comes to COVID. One of the things that we have noticed is that because of it being a humanitarian situation right now, so you find yourself having to really look for a space for what we'd call the environment sector. Yes. So for millennials who are in the environment sector, and right now everything is following on, let's say, health issues, survival issues, how one gets their bread and butter at the end of the day, what would you advise? How do they continue keeping on?
Wow, that's a technical one. No, I think I must agree. There's really no guidebook on how to live your life during such kind of pandemics, because it really caught almost every sector by surprise. Be it in the manufacturing, transport sector, conservation sector, financial sector. So really, I can't really prescribe a way to go about that right now. But I think what we must always think about in terms of resilience, and that's why I had that resilience component there. How do we prepare ourselves for these kind of times? Because when they will happen, they have happened before and they will sure do. And I think that's why I talked about being dynamic as well. You cannot get into the field as a conservationist. I am an ecologist, and the only thing I know is tracking elephants. And so if the tracking elephants, as an employment comes to an end, I'm rendered redundant. As a millennial, you really must be dynamic and understand a wide concept of things. You must be very dynamic and understand look at the broader view development. How do you ensure that there's a bit of relevance in what you're doing that fits into both sides? The trouble we have is, when somebody's trained in the university as an ecologist or a biologist, they want to go to the field and look for a project that is, collecting elephant dung and measuring what sort of food they eat. And once they have published a paper from that, they sit in the camp and wait for, looking for lions, cats, and things like that. Really, I think that is not the way to go now, because whatever you are doing must find its relevance in the wider discourse. I'll give you an example. Last week, I did a proposal that was looking at ecotourism and COVID. And it took me about 2 weeks thinking about that. I'm like, COVID and ecotourism, really? COVID is a humanitarian problem. It's a disease, it's a virus affecting people. So where does it come into ecotourism? And quickly, I told you about the political ecology. You have to really think broadly about the interaction. How do they interact? How do they affect one another? So that duality thing I'm talking about, that dynamism really needs to come out in you, and that can only come out if you engage yourself in, doing things broadly, including reading widely, but also engaging widely. You don't just attend meetings meant for conservation actors. Do you also attend meetings meant for, those in the financial sector, tourism sector, development sector, infrastructure sector? Get interested in learning so many other areas. You might be shocked that those in another sector, like infrastructure, for instance, really have got a lot of use for environmentalists. They have a lot of use for ecologists. And yet you only thought that as an ecologist, you can only go to KWS or go to African Conservation Center, African Wildlife Foundation, or WWF, but you realize that you can inform and do a lot better in those other sectors where they still don't see the need. And that's why I talked about identifying those opportunities and understanding the politics and plugging yourself in there. And this is something you can really benefit from. If you walked into Kenya Railways Corporation, for instance, you had a discussion about the impacts of their projects on nature. You realize they don't have any idea, or they don't have a department dealing with that. They don't have any regulations around that. Why don't you take it up? Engage, negotiate. So trying to make yourself relevant to the prevailing conditions is quite important. I think that's one way you can look at it, but I believe there's no prescriptive way of handling some of these emergencies, because you can never be prepared enough for them. You just have to adapt and be a little bit resilient.
Thank you very much. I think you've answered that question very well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Damaris. Any other question, Orina?
I have a question.
So Orina first, and then Frank.
Frank, yeah.
Dr. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We lost you.
Hi, Orina.
Can you hear me?
No, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I was just hoping to get some level of clarity on matters development, right?
Yes, yes.
I know this is a word, I mean, as a practitioner, I've really suffered with, because what is determined as development and what is looked at as development within the conservation world is gray matter development. So that's roads, any form of tarmac, concrete, brick and mortar. Mm-hmm. But in my time, I had a stint of time within Turkana, and I realized development talks much more than that. So, for example, the Land Access Bill that essentially has been put up to allow for the process of compulsory acquisition, takes to account the capital value, or say the market value of land within, which is an advantage to agricultural areas, but in pastoral areas like where you've worked in Kajiado, becomes a disadvantage because land is not viewed as in the same sort of lens as in agricultural rich areas. So I'm just thinking, are we getting it wrong? And I'm meaning, when I say we, I literally mean as a whole sector, but more than that, as a whole country. Are we getting that the determination of the word development wrong? So if a wildlife corridor, or not even a wildlife corridor, a pastoral corridor that takes into account wildlife, that takes into account resources like salt licks, water, grasslands, dry area and wet area, grasslands, and a road that is being, or a dam or a water pan that is essentially being looked at as something that can help the community. Are they being looked at? Is it something that we need to sort of streamline and define for ourselves before we start prescribing what development is? Or is it something that we should continue as things are? Thank you.
Good. Tony, do you want me to answer that first and then the other guy, yeah?
Frank, you can answer that first and then Frank. Okay.
All right. No, thank you so much. I think that's a very important observation you've made, and probably in my entire presentation, it didn't come out in a very clear manner. Now, your observation is quite critical, because most of the time when we define development, particularly, I think up until when we came up with the Human Development Index, development has always been defined on a dollar sign. In other words, if you look at the way they define developed versus underdeveloped and the least developed countries, the quick thinking is about dollar sign. How much money do they have, or what's the GDP? Now, recent discourses have actually tried to take us away from that kind of what I call unidimensional outlook of things. Development is quite multidimensional. And what is development to me might not necessarily be development to you. Just like the aspirations are varied, issues of poverty are also multidimensional. So for instance, you've just given a good example of communities where, land might not be a determinant of development to them, but perhaps livestock. And for them to determine that they are more developed, they need to have a certain number of livestock and have resources to ensure that livestock is healthy. So the livestock health and quality is a measure of their development. And this relies on natural resources. And that's why we talked about the duality. How you define development and its interaction with your existing natural resources is key. And you've rightly given a good example of the water pans and some of those dams that they use for watering livestock. In the SGR corridor, in our development corridor, as well as within the lab set, some of the things defined as development components, they include mega water projects or water transfer projects like the dams. And those constitute development in a different way because they provide basic resources that can enhance human growth and development, that can facilitate people to do other things towards achievement of their development. And you mentioned something about, if you wanted to go and implement some of these projects, then do we define this and go and implement? I think that's where we get it wrong sometimes, because you cannot define what development means for other people and go implement it for them. It must be bottom up. Their aspirations and their determinations of what development means for them must take precedence. And so if you define it from here and set your own indicators, then you will be measuring the wrong things. You will be looking at what people don't value. And I think that's been manifested in a lot of projects in the country that fall under the white elephants. Some of them were thinkings of the Nyayo era. They thought, we know what is best for our people, we are going to do it for them. And when they failed, they were left there because nobody saw any use for them. And of course, you've seen even in places where boreholes have been sunk, and people use that water for 1, 2, 3 months, and they abandon all the infrastructure there and get damaged. Now, these are external thinking that is then exported to the local communities. And so my thinking is real development must originate from the people. It must be based on their understanding of what they mean by their development. And that is quite critical. So some of the organizations now try to define that in what we are calling participatory development. How do they engage people to identify their priorities, and then they invest in what people have prioritized? To me, I think that's quite critical. And how that then interacts with conservation is quite key, because I mentioned 90% of most of our livelihoods, particularly in Africa, is derived from the existing natural resources. And that means we are either depleting or preserving what we have. There's no way you're going to attain a level of development without protecting the base of that development, which happens to be the natural resources, be it the rivers or the wetlands, swamps, forests, or whichever other resources. So to me, I think that's quite an important way of looking at it, as opposed to defining development in terms of the dollar sign and in terms of things like infrastructure alone, because those are just components of the wider scope of development. Where pavements have been erected, where roads have been constructed, of course, they have been constructed to facilitate certain activities which constitute further development. If you have the SGR running from Nairobi up to Kisumu, for instance, the understanding is it's supposed to facilitate trade, it's supposed to facilitate transfer of people, transfer of goods and services. Now, these services are meant to enhance the well-being of people, which in itself is development. So you really can't look at development from one lens. It has to be quite broad-based, but based on a very clear understanding of what really determines development for the target population.
Thank you very much for that. I hope Orina, you've been answered well. But if you have any questions, kindly just email Tobias. His number is on the screen. Frank, can you make it short, please? Because we've actually surpassed our time with almost 45 minutes. So make it short, kindly. Thank you.
All right, I'll make it short. Thank you so much, Dr.
Yes.
You actually had 3 questions, but you already covered. But then I have one, and I'll make it so brief as Tonya said. Now, with this millennial 21st century, we've seen and we've mentioned a lot of impediments. My question is, what is the future of conservation?
What is the future of conservation?
Yes.
A very tough one. Actually, that's a question I asked in one of the papers I wrote about the future of elephants in Laikipia as well as in Transmara, because of the competition between human development and natural resource conservation. Now, from one of the charts that we showed, Tony, about the interpolation of the decline in biodiversity, we get to a point where we have to ask ourselves whether it is business as usual or we have to think about a different scenario. So those 3 scenarios are quite critical for us to think about. And I wouldn't really tell you that I have the prescription for that. These are things that, just move on. These are things that are quite participatory and they're quite nuanced in a way. But the question is right, what is the future of conservation? From the way things are at the moment, the future of conservation seems really bleak unless we change the way we conduct business. The way things are, the way we are depleting resources, the way we are migrating from sustainability to just, investing in the dollar sign attainment, including, destruction of key areas of biodiversity. With the climate change coming in, it is really bleak, and I'll not lie about that. And that's why this figure is quite important to really help us jog our minds. Where do we want to be? Then using the other chart that I showed, how do we get there? So it kind of gives us the roadmap. But the reality is, as the red line shows, the way we are doing things now, we are heading towards that. So the future is definitely red and bleak, but we have alternatives and we have options to change that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much, Frank, and everyone else. Yeah, it's for just a word on Frank's comment. At some point, I actually mentioned I've been saying that conservation is actually dead if we don't think about our actions moving forward. We will scream, we will plant trees, we will make noise, but we need to actually take that particular action. This has been a very insightful session. Thank you very much. Thank you for those who've actually had time to attend. I thought we'll have more than 10 people, but that's good enough because those who are here have actually learned a lot from you. Dr. I have to be very honest with you. I will invite you for another session next time, probably soon. So just get prepared, especially on matters pertaining to how millennials can actually exploit different opportunities. Because if we do not have implementation of biodiversity action plans, it means that is a gap us as young people, rather than going to the streets and making noise about the construction of a particular development on a park or the road. We need to actually use that and actually create for ourselves employment by actually advocating for continuous implementation of the mitigation hierarchy by actually creating more jobs in the conservation sector. So that is something that I was really impressed with your presentation. That said, we are very grateful on behalf of Biophilic team and also grateful about those who participated. We were actually live on Facebook. So those on Facebook, thank you very much for tuning in. And we have an amazing week, an amazing month. We'll be sharing the poster soon with amazing young speakers. And this time around, we are heading for two Biophilic mentors. So we really want young people to actually engage, and not just engage, but engage more by pushing for actual actions, but not just speak, but actually, yeah. So thank you very much, and have a nice one. But engage more by pushing for actual actions, but not just speak, but actually, yeah. So thank you very much. Everybody can live at their own pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you and bye.
Bye. Good night.
All right. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you, everyone. All right. You're welcome.
Bye.